Can you believe it? This week marks the 25th anniversary of Super Mario Kart, the original pioneering game on Super Nintendo. Many imitators have come and gone, but that 1992 release set the template for 7 sequels, 8 if you count the excellent Mario Kart 8 Deluxe on Switch. That's one for each Nintendo home console or handheld, where each proved groundbreaking in their own right. And with one exception, all of these games targeted a full 60 frames per second too. So what better way to celebrate this milestone than to take a look at the technical evolution of Mario Kart. In the 25 years since its inception, the series has clearly come a long way, but how did we get from this to this? First, let's look at the original Super Mario Kart. Released in Japan on the 27th of August 1992, nobody could have predicted the success Super Mario Kart would go on to have or the legacy it'd create. Technically, we're looking at a humble beginning in some respects, with the Super Nintendo relying on its 2046x224 output mode to CRT screens of the day. It is of course most famous though, alongside F-Zero, for its revolutionary use of Mode 7 graphics. A lot's been said of this technique, but this was a landmark title for showing off what it could do. And it's hard to miss. Mode 7 created a pseudo 3D look in SNES titles by rotating and scaling a background layer on top of 2D sprites. These visuals may look primitive today, but it gave Super Nintendo a huge advantage over the competition at the time, notably Sega's Mega Drive. So much of this was helped by the fact the rotate and scale operations were handled natively on the Super Nintendo console, meaning no extra chip on the cartridges was needed. 2 picture processing units worked in tandem, taking a large 256x256 texture map tile and shifting the perspective from the conventional top-down view to a more dynamic side angle. It creates the floor to Mario Kart's maps, and once 2D sprites are planted on top, it gives a convincing illusion of 3D space using flat surfaces. In other words, the game didn't have to play from a scrolling bird's eye view as we had with Micro Machines on the Mega Drive, and for once the entire racetrack was in sight. This meant big things for Nintendo's mascots. At last we could see characters' faces from the front, side and back as they zipped around the track. In terms of the stats, that amounts to 12 sprites in a half rotation for Mario, while the other half is mirrored to create 22 in total. From that, Nintendo used 3 different sprite sets to factor in each character's distance from the camera. Crucially, it all meant approaching a corner or bend gave a sense of depth perception missing from so many races in the 16-bit generation. It wasn't perfect, jumps in sprite size can be jarring, and coins are only represented as marks on the map tile, but really the technology helped Super Mario Kart set itself from racing games of the era. One last curious aside before we move on. Due to the way Super Mario Kart's engine was built, the game only played in split screen. Now the idea here is that Super Mario Kart was optimized as a 2-player game first and foremost, and so the horizontal split stayed even in the single player mode. In Nintendo's eyes, F-Zero had been pitched as the faster single-player racer to use Mode 7 graphics, a launch title for the console in Japan. But without a specific engine rewrite for Mario Kart's solo play, it left us with only a circuit map on the lower half of the screen. It's a focus on multiplayer that really set a precedent for how Nintendo saw the series going forward. Super Mario Kart was and still is a special game and plays beautifully to this day at a faultless 60 frames per second, even in 2-player. The handling is still spot on, and even with the quirks of its pseudo 3D engine, the game has an air of timeless charm shared by many of SNES's best games. This wouldn't be the last Mario Kart to use Mode 7 though. On the home console front at least, Nintendo had much bigger plans. It took 4 years before we saw a true sequel, but as far as technology was concerned, its 2D trickery on SNES was on the way out to finally be replaced with true 3D rendering. To achieve a true 3D Mario Kart, we needed a new generation of hardware. Enter the Nintendo 64, a system designed to replace the 2D pixels of the past for a future built on polygons. Super Mario Kart 64 played to the strengths of its 3D hardware perfectly. Environments now had height, with structures like castles, hills, and bridges rising from the ground. The track layout also evolved. Pathways could now spiral up and down an incline, with deformations and bumps adding new dynamics to the race. And at last, coins and crates could finally be rendered as full objects, visible in the distance. The impact 3D rendering had on Mario Kart was a game changer. We'd gone from an entirely flat rotating texture to a fully fleshed out world, almost like pulling open a pop-up book. It's arguably the biggest technical jump in the series' history, and the choices made in 1996 had a lasting effect on every game since. It even brought a few series firsts in other areas. Voice sampling was added for all the characters. On top of that, it even made a jump from 2 players to 4-player split screen, which again became a staple for the series on console. Now, visually speaking, Mario Kart 64 marked a big departure in style too. The bright, cartoonish primary colours of the SNES original were ditched, and in came a more mature palette of muddy browns and dark greens. It's not a style that stuck around in later games, and in many ways it was a boast of Nintendo 64's impressive 3D rendering. We got hardware transformation and lighting across perspective correct textures, again helping to give Mario Kart 64's tracks a more realistic look. We also had alpha transparencies for smoke, dust, fire, sparks, and even background scenery like bushes. Graphically, it was a revolution in the console space, but as a Mario Kart game, it's almost unrecognizable to the original. For Nintendo, it was clearly a time of experimentation. Even with Nintendo 64's muscle in 3D rendering though, it still hit big technical limits. A great case in point is the use of level of detail management to control the number of polygons rendered on screen. The result was object pop-in, a method of culling polygons from the scene past a certain distance, but crucial for keeping the frame rate in check. Another limit came from N64's limited texture cache of 4 kilobytes, which gave surfaces that stretched blurred look. Armed with basic bilinear texture filtering too, and a basic blur pass to treat aliasing on that 320 by 240 image, it certainly sticks out as a game of its time. But all these are telling signs of a quintessential N64 release. It's slightly more flattering to see it on the Wii Virtual Console at least, and here I'm running at a locked 30 FPS with a quadrupled resolution of 640 by 480. Even so, it's a credit to that early phase in 3D console game development, even if technically Nintendo couldn't realize this vision entirely using polygons. It's true, in playing Mario Kart 64 for the first time, it doesn't take long to spot that only the environments are true 3D, while characters are advanced sprites. In this one sense, you could call it a direct evolution of Super Mario Kart. Looking at Mario's sprite, for example, we go from 12 unique sprites in a half rotation on SNES to 34 on N64. The method has changed on N64 though, with the rasterization technique being used here rather than straight 2D pixel art. In effect, this is similar to the method of Donkey Kong Country, letting Nintendo render high quality 3D models of each character offline before turning each model into a 2D sprite from each angle. Paired with full 3D backgrounds, it gives the game a unique look. However, it's fair to say these 2D sprites don't hold up too well today. Characters appear blurry if you get too close, and even with more sprites to work with, the transition between each one during a camera pan is still quite jarring. The sprite work is still far more nuanced than the SNES original though. Not only do sprite sets vary by distance, but also the incline of a road, plus a separate 32 frame animation for crashes. Clearly, this was not an easy process, but taking the 2D route for characters freed up more polygons on the N64, which in theory meant a bigger budget for track detail. Even with this workaround, Super Mario Kart 64 did have performance problems. To this day, it's the only game in the series too technically cutting edge to target 60 FPS in single player. Instead, Nintendo opted for a 30 FPS target, and even then it struggled on complex tracks like DK Jungle Parkway. So here we have genuine N64 captures running through our tools, and it's tempting to imagine how the game could have performed with full 3D models as well. The performance tends to stick at 30 for a lot of the race, but the drops to near 20 FPS are jarring. And really, that's something that only intensifies with more players in split screen. In fact, its contemporary Diddy Kong Racing, which arrived a few years later, shows the other path with true 3D character models. Inevitably, we saw harder sustained drops on tough circuits there, and really it showed a hard limit on how far the N64 could be pushed. But really, these are nitpicks next to Nintendo's raw achievements here. After the breakthrough of Super Mario Kart 64 seemingly reinvented the wheel to suit the needs of a new console. And that shift to 3D forever changed our expectations of the series. It is funny then that the next major Mario Kart returned to 2D sprites. The next major release, Super Circuit, released on the Game Boy Advance in 2001, but serves as more of a tangent to the series line. At its core, this is a spiritual successor to the Super Nintendo original, evolving its Mode 7 style graphics engine. It even featured all the original game's levels in a retro section, but leveraged the handheld's power to enhance them. So what does that mean? Well, texture quality improved massively. Item boxes were rendered as full sprites, though coins remained as flat textures on the floor. We even got more detail, more tree sprites, enemies, pipes, and up to 3 scrolling parallax layers for the background, up from the basic 2 layers on SNES. The only downside is the lower native res of the Game Boy Advance compared to SNES's 240p, but on the other hand, the screen real estate is fully used here, and obviously it doesn't rely on a forced horizontal split. Unlike on SNES, all the pixels here are being used to show the game action. Another neat enhancement is in sprite animation. Now this varies by character, but Mario gets a decent jump, from the 12 sprites in a half rotation on Super Mario Kart to 25 in Super Circuit on Game Boy Advance. but overall the characters have more gradients to work with during a 360 turn. For replays, it just means a less jarring pan motion to the camera. Accepting that most parts of the game are upgraded in Super Circuit, one aspect did take a step back. Compared to the 60 FPS playback on Super Nintendo, the Mode 7 graphics only technically run at 30 FPS on Game Boy Advance. To be clear, all characters update at the full 60 FPS with a new sprite per frame. Similarly, all the trees in the background update at 60 FPS too, and that includes the parallax scrolling background layers. Strangely though, the rotation calculation on the track itself is cut down to a straight 30 FPS. Given that the area with arguably the most movement is cut to a half refresh like this, it's definitely a downgrade in playability from the original. And it's certainly not an exceptional case on Game Boy Advance. Konami Crazy Racers, a similar Mode 7 style racer also released in 2001, had a similar issue running at a true 60 FPS on the handheld. This was a decent riff on the same concept, but in this case, Game Boy Advance updates everything at 30 FPS. Konami's approach is much stricter, but tried to create an illusion of 60 FPS simply by alternating between track rotation and then the sprites on screen. For Mario Kart Super Circuit, overall, it gave the series' 2D graphics a final farewell, in many ways enhanced for the small screen. From here on out though, both consoles and handheld had the ability to push full 3D with no compromise. For anyone itching to see a true 3D successor, the GameCube came and delivered with Mario Kart Double Dash. With its vastly upgraded texture memory and GPU clocks, Nintendo pushed out a full 640x480 picture from the machine. On top of that, we had more advanced character animations, lighting, and even post effects like depth of field. And most crucially of all, the game still rendered all this at a flawless 60 frames per second. It's clear the series' trademark visual style has started to form in Double Dash. Gone was the harsh textures and blocky environments of Mario Kart 64, and aesthetically, it blended advancements in 3D with a move back to a colourful cartoon cel-shaded style introduced on SNES. Direct comparison with earlier games are tricky meanwhile. Double Dash is unique for avoiding the retro circuits entirely, and we get an entirely fresh slate of courses, plus a unique mechanic putting two players in the same kart. But above all else, the revolution in Double Dash was in its multiplayer features and performance. We'd already gone from 2 to 4 players on the last two Nintendo consoles, but in a single generational leap, GameCube now offered 16 player races across a local network. At the time, it was unprecedented, and even with 4 players in split screen, the game engine still managed to run at 60 frames per second. Given the shaky sub 30 FPS drops on the N64, this was a real breakthrough, finally cementing a 60Hz refresh as the standard for the series going forward. And it makes sense too. Running at 60 FPS fit the design ethos of Mario Kart GP 1 and 2, which ran in arcades using the same GameCube engine. But sadly, holding that target just wasn't to be a given in multiplayer for later games. Returning to handheld, the Nintendo DS received its own signature Mario Kart that again defied expectations of a portable. What we had on DS was an enhanced 3D version of the Nintendo 64 release in many respects, this time with online play and split across 2 screens. There's no competing with Double Dash, and again this is something of a tangent from the console line of games, but still fascinating in its own right. Next to the N64 release in 1996, it showed just how far handheld technology had come in 9 years. With the DS's 512KB texture memory, for example, it could allow textures up to 1024x1024 in size, a huge leap from the 32x64 maximum on Nintendo 64. It helped avoid the blurred smear on the game's 3D stages, but sadly there is a downside. The DS version only uses point texture filtering, a step back from even the murky bilinear approach used on N64. All of which meant DS produced a rougher, more pixelated effect on distant textures, though on its smaller screens it wasn't too glaring. It's remarkable how much fit into the DS version's 33MB ROM. Much like Double Dash, it uses fully polygonal 3D models for characters and items, again a big advantage over N64's sprite work. Though to keep that 60 FPS target in check, level of detail culling had to be aggressive for upcoming geometry. All told, this was an impressive release. While the DS had a strict limit on poly counts, it worked around them to deliver a great 60 FPS rendition of the game. It also introduced dual screen views, letting the secondary ARM7 2D processor, usually leveraged for handling Game Boy Advance backcompat, handle a top-down map on the lower screen. All of which left the top 192p screen to handle the 3D. Mario Kart DS's biggest revolution may well have been its online play, but visually, it showed the handheld versions edging closer to the standard of the home console. For Mario Kart Wii, Nintendo used what is essentially higher clock GameCube hardware to improve the formula once again. Inevitably, there's a sense of diminishing returns across each generation, but Wii's refinements were worthwhile. Compared to Double Dash, the benefits were small but numerous. Massively improved post effects, including bloom lighting, lens flare, and the team also reduced the overbearing depth of field from the last game. Texture quality and filtering also took a noticeable jump over Double Dash, while character models pushed a visibly higher poly count on Mario and company. But clearly, this was meant as a revision of the existing GameCube engine. Even returning levels like Peach Beach are more or less direct transplants from that version. Wii's IBM architecture had a clear overlap with GameCube's, but even so, Nintendo did include a few enhancements to sweeten the deal. The textures and dimensions of Peach Beach were preserved of course, but now with extra decorations, like new pianta folk watching the race from the flanks. Of course, the new maps pushed the hardware even further. Tracks built from the ground up on Wii give a better sense of the machine's capabilities, even if unfortunately we're still stuck at 480p as the machine's best output. The one catch, as you can expect, single player runs at 60 frames per second, but it's at this point that Nintendo began forcing 3 and 4 player games at a half refresh 30 FPS. From 3DS onwards, Mario Kart's identity as a 3D racer had more or less settled. Looking at a level like Mushroom Gorge, 3DS's visuals are surprisingly close to the Wii version from a few years earlier. As a handheld version, this brought a serious package to the table. In many respects, this marked a huge leap over the GameCube version, and broached what was currently possible on home console. But the big addition for 3DS wasn't so much the quality of its textures and effects, but the arrival of stereoscopic 3D. Outputting two 400x240 viewpoints at 60 frames per second is no small feat, but this is exactly what Nintendo EAD achieved, and the results have a huge benefit on a racing game where depth perception is crucial. The logical comparison is with Mario Kart DS of course. Really though, by this point it's clear the rate of improvement on Nintendo's handhelds was much faster than on the console front. In 2011, Mario Kart no longer felt constrained by handheld technology, but strengthened by it. Even at a lower resolution, the visuals and level design gave the impression of a major release, deserving a numbered title. Unlike Super Circuit, which felt like an offshoot in the series' evolution, this was the next major step. It also gave the stereoscopic 3D effect a chance to shine, something sadly put aside for the latest game. As the last numbered entry in the series, Mario Kart had it all. At last, Wii U let us push past the resolutions on Wii, catapulting us up to 1280x720. In terms of the engine design, the handling and the track layouts, this had all the marks of an enhanced console version of Mario Kart 7. The game added anti-gravity racing segments, but kept the verticality of the flying and swimming sections. And if we look over comparisons against 3DS stages, there's no question every area is optimized for Wii U. From textures to effects to the geometry, entire tracks like DK Jungle are overhauled. What you're seeing here is actually the Switch version rendering at 1080p, but the core assets and everything besides are the same as what we had on Wii U. Mario Kart 8 on Wii U looked incredible and still found ways to outshine the Wii version. However, it also continues a few unfortunate trends for the series. Texture filtering still relies on a simple bilinear approach, causing cascade lines to appear on the ground. Another gripe here, no anti-aliasing whatsoever, meaning Wii U pushes a sharp 720p image blighted by pixel crawl. Otherwise, graphically, Mario Kart 8's superb artwork helps put it at the series' peak. The style of Mario Kart's visuals and mechanics blended together perfectly by this point, and really, this is Nintendo EAD firing on all cylinders. From the underwater races showing off its new shaders and screen space effects to the rapid hang gliding, it's simply a joy to play. Again, 3 to 4 player races force a 30 FPS cap, but for once we can take 2 players into an online game. The only thing missing was a full-fledged battle mode, which Nintendo addressed 3 years later on Switch. All of which brings us to the modern day, with Deluxe taking possibly the pinnacle of the series and refining it again at a native 1080p. And what's more to say, for the Switch version, the defining feature really is that flexibility to play games however you like. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe marks the point where handheld and console games at last converge. In a way, we saw it coming as well, with the Game Boy Advance, DS and finally 3DS versions getting closer and closer to console visual standards. But finally, a Mario Kart has arrived that looks and plays identically on both sides, barring that difference in resolution whether held in the hand or played under a TV. Just imagine taking this back in time 25 years and seeing the reaction of someone handed a Switch with this running. Looking back on the series as a whole, it's staggering to chart Mario Kart's progress across a quarter of a century. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe may be a current favourite and unmatched in content, but each game leading up to it brought something major to the table, from Mode 7 graphics to polygonal 3D to online play right up to rendering at a full 1080p. The series is emboldened with each step. which makes you wonder what's left for a potential Mario Kart 9. Gameplay innovation over graphics is Nintendo's mantra, but with Deluxe being a straight conversion from Wii U, it's tempting to imagine what Switch could do with a dedicated entry. Anyway, that's enough from me. A big thank you if you made it all the way to the end here. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the series so far and what you think a new Mario Kart game could add. As ever, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this analysis, and remember to check out our Patreon at Digital Foundry for the original source file to this video. But until next time, thanks for watching.